Hi, this is David with EV World News, where we talk about electric vehicles, green energy, and the stock markets. Today, I'm going to talk about the top 10 most frequently asked questions we get about electric vehicles. And some of this is kind of it can vary from week to week on what some of these might be. I mean, I get ones all the time asking about various topics, and I see them kind of over and over again. Now, one of the big ones, though, is, of course, in the long run, does it make financial sense to purchase an electric car instead of a gas-powered vehicle? Well, from a financial perspective, they've been expensive. So at first, the early adopters were buying your Teslas, which were considered by price to be basically a luxury car. But that's coming down. We're really seeing a lot of cheap cars come into the market. As I reported on Friday, there was the Bolt EV, the base model with the federal incentive. It's only $18,500. So if you qualify for the tax credit, and that's at the point of purchase. I mean, they're getting really cheap. There's going to be a VinFast VF3 that's a small SUV that's going to be essentially right at about $20,000. And that's without any tax credits. So there's a lot of stuff coming down the pipe that's really going to be a lot less expensive. And eventually you have to replace the battery in them, but that could be typically they're expected to last for 200,000 miles. I mean, most people aren't driving their car at 200,000 miles. There are, obviously exceptions, especially with pickup trucks. People will drive them a lot farther. They'll keep putting new engines in them, things like that. It's not really any different. But ultimately, electricity is a lot cheaper than gasoline on a mile per mile basis. So the vehicles are going to be cheaper to operate. They're just as inexpensive to purchase. And so there's going to be more and more selection out there for folks. The next is, what kind of services do you need to perform on electric cars? Because they don't have oil changes, they don't have timing belts. They do require the tires being replaced more often, and the tires are more expensive. It really depends on the vehicle. Tesla tires in particular, because Tesla has very large batteries because they have very long range, tend to be quite a bit pricier than those of regular gas-powered cars. You're probably looking more in a 30 to 40,000 mile span rather than 50,000 miles on regular gas cars. The battery has to be replaced, at approximately 200,000 miles. So you just don't have a lot of the same mileage. You're certainly not taking your vehicle in for an oil change every few months. Big question, are electric cars dependable? Now, one of the things with electric cars is they should be just as dependable as gas-powered cars. Electric motors have fewer moving parts, and therefore they have a lot fewer points of failure than gas-powered engines. I hear all the time about electric cars being recalled, but these recalls kind of a misnomer, because a lot of the times the cars aren't brought into the dealership. It's simply a software update done wirelessly over Wi-Fi to your car. And it's pretty amazing that is, the way things go. Now, another one is, why are electric cars so expensive? And a lot of it is because the batteries are expensive. That's the really expensive part of the car. Replacing one in the past, you'll hear stories of them costing 20-something thousand dollars. I've heard of people going and Tesla charging about $12,000 to replace a battery. But the prices of batteries have come down by more than 50% in the last 2 years. And they're expected to pretty much do that again in the next 2 years. So that's really falling. One of the things, too, is especially with Tesla started working with this thing called a GigaPress, which basically creates what was about 50 parts under the car as one single casting. And GM actually bought the company out from under Tesla that was doing the GigaPress, creating the GigaPress devices for Tesla. GM now owns that. So they'll obviously add that to their lineup as well. So you're going to see both between the cost of batteries coming down and the GigaPress, things like that, you're going to see a lot less expensive electric vehicles. Are electric cars as safe as other vehicles? I hear this thing about your car could catch on fire, but even if it does catch on fire, they don't explode. You can get out a lot easier than a gasoline-powered fire. And their rate of them catching on fire is incredibly low compared to gas-powered cars. And it's interesting to see. It's something like 50-1 chance of you buying a gas car or a battery-powered car and it eventually catching on fire during the lifetime of the automobile. Now, one thing though, in winter, electric cars are definitely safer. They drive much better on ice. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you don't have to wait for the gas pedal to engage. And so you have instant torque immediately. So the vehicle can be very responsive on ice. Now, of course, they meet all the same federal safety standards as other cars, and you won't be hauling around gallons of combustible fuel wherever you go. Although, to be fair, I've never had a car catch on fire. I've had computer monitors catch on fire. I've had a few other weird things catch on fire, microwave ovens, things like that. But I've never had a car do it. And I don't know if I've even known people that have had a car catch on fire. But it is one of those things that, is always I guess, a fear that you hear about EVs. There's this fear that if they're in a parking garage, they catch on fire. It's just not something that really happens. There has been a lot of incidents with cheap batteries, for instance, and basically electric bikes, and some of those have caught on fire, and so that's been an issue. Next one is, what's the lifespan of electric car battery? Now, this initially, when you had just the Nissan Leaf and the Chevy Bolt and a couple of others, some of those cars had some problems with batteries. And that's not really the case anymore. I don't think there's been any battery problems out of the Chevy Bolt since 21. And the Leaf ones, well, there's been 1 million Nissan Leafs sold in the United States, I believe. I mean, but it's been over a very long period of time. It wasn't all in 1 year. But basically, they're supposed to last for about 200,000 miles before you need to replace them. Even then, the batteries aren't worn out, and the batteries don't go to be recycled. They go to be repurposed. They end up being used in energy storage applications. For instance, if you had a 100 kilowatt hour battery in a Tesla long range, and it was taken out, it could go into a house and be used for energy storage to store if you had solar panels or you're using it for a backup generator. That's basically what the Tesla power walls are. They're just a collection of car batteries that are there to store the solar and allow you to not need to have a separate generator. Now, here's a big one. How far can a typical electric car travel on a single charge? Now, if you have a plug-in hybrid, those usually only have a battery that's, say, like 30 to 60 miles. Although I see some coming out, like the Dodge Ram for 2025 is going to have a 150-mile range on the battery before it switches over to fuel. But for the most part, your full battery electric vehicles have anywhere from, on the very low end, about 100 miles, on the high end, just over 500 miles. But that 500-mile vehicle is the Lucid Air, and it's the one with the 500-mile battery is over $100,000. So that's, you're really going from the low end to the high end. The more money you spend, the longer the range is going to be. Now, what's probably typical right now, it's probably about 280 miles. Seems to be 260 to 280s. It seems to be about the sweet spot on most EVs coming out onto the market. And that's because that seems to be a pretty reasonable range or amount of cost to put into the car for the battery. And with the flip side of not making the vehicle too heavy, also it's a pretty reasonable amount of distance that someone could go if they were doing highway driving to give them a decent amount of range. Now, is there an infrastructure to support electric car recharging? Most people drive fewer than 50 miles per day. Now, unless you're using your vehicle commercially or you're a traveling salesperson driving from town to town every day, you should be able to recharge your vehicle at home. And this is one of the big advantages of an EV. If you have a garage or you have a dedicated parking space with your own charging station at home, it's no different than plugging in your cell phone to charge it up. You just charge it up, and then the next day you unplug it and you take your car with you and go, and you have a full charge. Most people only charge the batteries up to 80% of max range, and that's done because the more you do that, the longer the battery will last. Now, currently in the United States, there's about 250,000 public charging stations, And that's a lot more than I think people would realize. The goal is in the next 5 years to get that up to about 750,000. And anyways, we will, we'll see where that gets to. Anyways, next, are electric cars really more environmentally friendly than gas-powered vehicles or hydrogen-fueled cars? Now, in general, this is yes. Now, initially, an EV, when it's manufactured, because of the manufacture of the battery, has more pollutant properties. The European Union has stated that they believe that number where they cross over is about equivalent about 12,000 miles, about 18,000 kilometers. Okay, is how far it takes to drive an EV when is the tipping point of where it uses less polluting materials. And typically over the lifetime of an EV, it uses anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of what we get out of the other type of vehicles. Now, the last one, this one's kind of interesting. So the very first electric car was built in the 1830s. So we're talking almost 200 years ago by a gentleman named Thomas Davenport. And he's considered to be the inventor of the electric motor, and he was responsible for electric streetcars. And but these were basically set on rails. So when this started, there weren't really roads that were appropriate for anything. I mean, even for horse and buggy, you had challenges taking them out over the prairies where there weren't roads. So range and production costs, gas-powered vehicles could clearly then travel farther than electric counterparts. Now, if you look even today at trains, most of them are hybrid diesel electric trains. They're using a mix to try to maximize the power output and range, of the trains. Henry Ford's work on mass production for the Model T made gas-powered cars far cheaper to produce. This basically wiped out electric cars for about 100 years. Now, another big question I get all the time outside of the top 10, it has to do with winter range. People seem to have this mistaken idea that the battery just stops working when it's cold. And in reality, they do get less range. Now, let's assume you're just commuting and your vehicle, you're only charging it to 80%. And so you have about, say, 200 miles of range on your vehicle to start with. Well, if it's below zero, you could lose up to 40% of your range and only have 120 miles left on your vehicle. But if you're only driving 50 miles or less a day, it's a non-issue. Now, gas cars also typically use about 15% more energy when they're driven in that kind of weather, and they take a while to warm up, all kinds of other issues. So there's different things that affect both. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the topic for today. Please like this video so that it can get shown to more people. Feel free to leave a comment, and please remember to subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, have a great day.